Since this boat is 11'8" and a sheet of plywood is only 8 feet long, we have to scarf together a bunch of parts. The keel, the bottom panels or garboards, and then the chine and shear planks. In your set of plans, you'll have a sheet with instructions for the scarfing jig and its use. It's pretty straightforward. There'll be a wide scarfing table and then a covering piece as well, which we call the follower board. And then each one of these pieces that needs to be scarfed together will have corresponding holes in them that allow you to drive a nail through the scarfing table, drop those pieces right on the nails as well, and then clamp it all together. And we'll go through a little bit of process. You do have to do some modification. Occasionally the thickness isn't quite right, or the CNC cutting of the scarf can be a little bit wonky, so you do want to do a dry run. Make sure that everything is exactly where you need it to be, nice and flat and flush before you start gluing anything up. This is the scarfing table that you'll get with the kit. It has 4 holes that are drilled in it. They will be nice and tight to take a 16-penny nail, drive that up from the underside, and this will allow you to register your plank and keel pieces. And then you'll take your pieces. Now this one is the chine plank. Line it up, it should slide right on there. Now this gets flipped over. Just slide on there and match up that scarf. It's really important here to make sure that these two surfaces are flush to each other. So you can kind of see that this one is a little bit proud. Doesn't quite land flush. There's a pretty easy solution to this. Take a hard block to sand either side of that scarf. And here you can use these striations of the layers of plywood to make sure that everything is even. They should all be straight and evenly exposed throughout the scarf. Let's see if that made any difference. And yeah, it's a little bit better. You kind of keep going with this. You're just taking a little bit off at a time. You don't want to go too far with it. And since this is kind of a feather edge, it's a good idea to bring it over so it's supported as you sand. Alright, so now you can see this is nice and smooth. And you got a pretty good lack of gap. Nobody's overlapping. So taking this time at this point in the assembly of the plank will save you on the other end, where you might end up with a bump here that will require sanding and a bunch of work to get smooth, to make it go away so you don't have a weird bumpy spot in your plank on the finished boat. So I'm going to get ready to glue up these bigger planks, the bottom planks, garboards. I've laid plastic down. You can tape. You want to just span that scarf and make sure you don't glue your planks to your scarfing board. And we're going to set this up so that I can do both of these planks at the same time. Essentially they're the same shape. You can use them to index each other, lay them down, clamp them all together. I've set this up like so that once I put my once I put that plank on, I'll lay it this way, and then I can put the next plank on top, put another piece, and then my covering board and clamp it all together. So I have some straight epoxy mixed up and some thickened with some structural fillers in there, colloidal silica or wood dust as well. And I like to wet out the scarf first, thin layer of the straight epoxy. Okay. And then a quantity of the thickened epoxy. It's important here to not put so much on that it will sort of prevent your scarf from closing up. But you do want squeeze out. You don't want too little. And I usually just add that onto one side. All nice and evenly on there. I like to check and make sure that it's a nice smooth transition from one piece to the next. The holes that are drilled in the planks are slightly larger than your nails, so there is a tiny bit of wiggle room, and you do want to make sure that everything is nice and even there. So that looks pretty good. Add my next layer of plastic. Let's start the next plank. Good. See that squeeze out. So before I clamp here, I'm going to come up to either end and make sure that each of these pieces is aligned with the other. Just throw a clamp on that. That's clamped down, and all these are nice and clean and even. And then do the same on this end. I've added a third sawhorse just to support this so that it doesn't try and sag down as it's being glued up. Okay. One last piece of plastic and lay it on there. And you should also get in your kit the following board, which really just adds a little bit of stiffening to the whole system and a nice clamping surface. And you want to set your clamp basically right over that scarf so that you're clamping and you can kind of see it there. Your scarf's right about here, so you want to get that clamp right in the middle there. You're not trying to squeeze all of the glue out of there. You want glue to be in that scarf to hold it together. You want it clamped so that there's squeeze out and so that things feel flush and clean, but you don't want to squeeze all of the glue out of your joint. Since this board is so wide for the following board, I'm going to add a little piece, just a scrap of plywood here, to create spread on that load from this clamp. Just a little bit. Now I can feel that that's all nice and flush. So I'm throwing one more little block in there just to make sure that I'm covering the whole scarf with nice even clamping pressure. And again, not going crazy because I do want to leave some epoxy in my joint. Just peek in there and make sure, got good squeeze out. and everyone should be happy. Once you have this set up, you want to leave it for as long as is needed for the epoxy to cure. This can vary depending on where you are. If you used a fast hardener or a slow hardener, the temperature. In Maine it's cold. This space is pretty cold overnight. I'm going to leave this overnight and possibly into the next day just to be sure. You can always check your epoxy, see if you can, if it's still green, essentially you'll be able to sort of pick at it with a fingernail or with relative ease. It'll kind of break off. You don't want to stress this scarf until you know that the glue or the epoxy is fully cured. This is my shear plank and it's already scarfed up. I've got my squeeze out here, and what I'm going to do is just take a heat gun, scrape this away, see if my edges are even. If they're not, make sure to sand everything flat and flush before it goes onto the boat. I like to eliminate as much of that filled epoxy as possible. Epoxy that has the silica in it or any fillers is often harder than the plywood. So you can find yourself sanding and getting a little bit of the epoxy and a lot of the plywood around it, and it creates kind of more problems for you than solutions. So I try and get as much of that out of this situation as possible before I start sanding. Now this one is a little bit bumpy. There's not a smooth transition from one side of the scarf to the other. So I'm going to sand it down and start with a 60 grit. Just see what I can get up. Okay, got that close. I'm going to use a smaller block just to get the rest. And this one just has 80 grit. Okay, I'm happy with that. I can see by taking the time at the beginning of the scarf to avoid this kind of situation is quite useful. Saves you a little bit of hassle and trouble of potentially having a wavy or weird spot in your plank, or an area where you have to add more putty to try and fill it in and make it smooth.